What's that? I didn't hear.
Did you do the program names, not numbers?
Yes.
You did it?
I
You gave
signed
it
up
to-
for it.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. But I think it's not going to happen till
January, till next
February,
year.
January.
Yeah,
Yeah,
next, right.
correct. Yeah, I did. I'm on
Because
the,
I
I'm on the
just
list.
remembered my son-in-law just said to me last night, my daughter used to be like chair at one of the schools, and he said, well, if you get me something for names, not numbers.
Yeah.
So wonderful.
Yeah, I'll do
These
it.
are the perils of Zoom.
Oh.
We'll
See,
get
this
some.
is what
Yeah.
I said, that if you're
Yeah.
in or out.
Yeah. Welcome, everyone. Those who are joining us in person, especially those who are joining us on Zoom. These are the perils of Zoom. We have more people on Zoom, tens of people on Zoom, and fewer in person. But we're able to enfranchise a lot of people who otherwise might not be able to get out tonight to join us for various reasons. So we're honored to have you with us online, in person. Special welcome to our esteemed speaker, Dr. Garber. And just by way of introduction this evening for Yom HaShoah, Tafshin Pei Bet finds us in a bit of a different place, or maybe more than a bit of a different place than where we were just 1 year ago. I found my notes from last year's Yom HaShoah, in which I spoke about the fact that it was 80 years to the destruction that transpired during the Shoah at Babin Yar in Kiev, where 33,771 people were murdered there, and described a little bit about my own story, going to visit it with students in 1999 and being there again in 2010. And here we are a year later with everything that's been transpiring. And there, of course, are certain parallels and certain very important substantive differences. But tonight, we're here to focus ourselves on Zachor, on remembering what transpired during the Shoah, and our congregation through the years, with many thanks to Lynn and Irv Shapiro, have made sure year over year that we have a commemoration for Kristallnacht and a commemoration for Yom HaShoah, no less than we have a commemoration of Tisha B'Av and days of celebration that are on our calendar. We have days of commemoration. And I want to thank them very much. Also, a co-chair of education is joining us this evening, Dr. Phil Greenland, for all of his good work and assistance. Our congregational president, Daniel Rosenthal, is joining us on Zoom this evening for all of his good work as well in bringing tonight to fruition. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about personally, and I don't know if others are also thinking about it, is about news and information arriving. And we are wondering, even with all of our devices and gizmos and computers and handhelds, about so much unknown information about what's transpiring now in Eastern Europe. And I try to put myself back in those days, 80 plus years ago, when the news was making the rounds. Martin Gilbert writes in his voluminous work, The Holocaust, about what happened in November of 1941. Inside the Warsaw Ghetto, news of a horrific kind arrived during November 1941. Hearing it, the chairman of the Jewish Council, Adam Chernikov, summoned the leading members of the underground to hear the message. His name was Henryk Grabowski. I came to Chernikov. Sylvia Lubetkin later recalled it was the evening, there was no electricity, and Henryk told his story. Grabowski had been sent by the Jews of Warsaw to Wilno, and he had returned. The story Grabowski told was about Ponar. For the first time, Sylvia Lubetkin recalled, we heard that Jews of Vilna are being deported by the thousands and tens of thousands are being killed, children and women. Yitzhak Zuckerman had also been summoned to hear Grabowski's report. I am from Vilna myself, he later recalled. I was born in Vilna. In Vilna, I left behind all my parents and relatives, and here he brought the tragic news from Vilna. While still a child, I'd played among the trees in Ponar, and here he spoke about Ponar. My Vilna, the Jews of Vilna, were being killed in Ponar, my playground. Zuckerman and his friends realized that once the truth of Grabowski's report, they realized also that it was now a question of the total destruction of the Jews of Europe. How honored we are this evening to welcome a survivor who knows all about Vilno and Vilnius as it's known today. And we'll hear from him in a few minutes this evening. and to consider what it means that so many of us get our information about the Shoah from books, and how honored and privileged we are to be able to hear from eyewitnesses who lived and survived. This week in synagogues around the world, we'll be reading the Torah portion of Achrei Mot. The name of the parsha is actually after death. It speaks about the death of the two sons of Aaron and the way in which Aaron, the high priest, Aaron HaKohen, was told, commanded to carry on. And he was given all the instructions about how he could continue the service in the sanctuary, in the Kodesh, in the place of the Mikdash, in the Mishkan, in the Midbar. And he was given all sorts of instructions. And in the instructions, there are two added words. Here are the instructions he should follow. And then the Torah adds, V'lo yamut, and he shall not die. And the simple understanding of that is that the consequence for not following the rules, God forbid, is on pain of death. But the Sifra, the Medrash Halacha, describes that ve'ein anu yodim hanemar lo b'dibur rishon, we're not even sure what was spoken to Aaron. What does it mean? He should not come at all time, and he'll follow his instructions. He shall not die. The Sfat Emet, the Rebbe from Gura Calvaria, actually, the suburb of Warsaw, said that we could interpret the words "V'lo yamut," he shall not die, not as a consequence of him not following instructions properly, but rather speaking to a despondent man who had survived and his sons had left the world. The will of God is that this person, Aaron HaKohen, a survivor, should continue to live, and he should not decide to give up or to die. This is a heavy charge. And for those of us who are zocha, privileged to know members of our esteemed community right here at Or Torah, but around the world who are involved in Holocaust memorialization, we know that with so many survivors, this is a very challenging charge, v'lo yamut, but rather to live. Out of the ghetto in Vilna came the song that so many of us know from our childhood, Zognet Kemel, the song of the Partisans. Never say that you've reached the very end. Though leaden skies a bitter future may portend, and the hour for which we've yearned will yet arrive, and our marching step will thunder. We survive. Written by Hirsch Glick, who first sang it to his friend in Vilna in May of 1943. Hirsch Glick, we do not know his fate. It's assumed after he was deported to a concentration camp in Estonia after the uprising that he was killed. But his words live on. And the declaration, we survive, gave so much hope. Merzain and Do doesn't translate exactly, but it's along those lines. We'll now light some memorial candles. We should have in mind as we're lighting those memorial candles that the candles really cannot possibly do justice to the number of candles they really have to light. My children's school, Hill Torrance Suburban Day School, has some kind of a program. They wanted the kids to take 6 million steps to try to help them to understand what does it mean 6 million. And the truth is, it's not a number we can really wrap our heads around. I went to the United Center a little while ago, and I saw the adulating fans around. I was trying to calculate how many people are here, and of course, my son is Googling, how many people are there. And I'm trying to imagine stadia after stadia after stadia. It's impossible to understand. So we light 6 candles as the tradition of our congregation now for over 50 years, just to remind ourselves that the number is mind-boggling. But we have to put some light into the world. We'll call upon Dr. Garber's family members to kindly come forward to light these 6 lights and to think about the 6 million. And then we'll hear the story of one. And hopefully through that, we'll gain some more knowledge of Zachor and what it means to carry this message forward, not just from books, but heart to heart. Things that emerge from the heart that hopefully will enter the heart as well. So I call the family forward kindly to light our 6 candles of memorialization this evening. I'd like to ask Lynn to kindly come forward to introduce our speaker this time.
First, as always, deep, deep gratitude to you, Rabbi Engel, for your dedication to commemorate Yom HaShoah and to remember for the victims and for the survivors. And Ed, you spoke on Chag for the future, for understanding that we can only build the future if we know the past and understand our heritage, where we come from. It's interesting because we're like going between Zoom and coming back in person now. I just want to mention that the past few commemorations have been over Zoom, and I've worked together with a young man, AJ Magid from Dallas, who's on here, who's been really passionate about Holocaust education and was not so involved this time because his wife gave birth, they had a baby boy, and I mention it to give him a mazal tov, but to let you know that this is exactly the point. He had a baby boy that was named after their great grandparents and a great uncle of his wife's who survived the Shoah and then died a few weeks later in a DP camp, so that his memory should continue and go on. Tonight begins Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, the day to remember the Shoah, to hear of the crimes perpetrated on our people, to learn about the communities and the Jewish lives during that era, and also to recognize the Gvura, the inner courage of those who lived through the Shoah, the victims and the survivors. Tonight in the Jewish calendar is Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura. This year it coincides with the secular calendar date of April 27th, a day that is significant for me on a personal level. On April 27th, 1945, my mother, Margaret Weiss Kirsch, was liberated from Torgau, a subcamp of Buchenwald. On April 27th, 2007, 62 years later, my father passed away, having survived Auschwitz, Magdeburg, and the death march from Buchenwald, and having lived to see great-grandchildren with deep gratitude, as he said when his first great-grandchild was born. Who knew when I was in Auschwitz that I would live to see a fourth generation? This year, 2022, my granddaughter, Ariella, went on a heritage trip with her school from Israel, where she's studying, to Poland and specifically to Auschwitz. She stood by the gas chambers at Auschwitz and spoke to the group as a great-grandchild of survivors and as the fifth generation of my grandparents who were sent directly to the gas chambers. At that spot, our son-in-law, Mikey Pearl, Ariella's father, said the prayer, Kel Malay, for all the victims of the Shoah, building the future, remembering the past. I'm so grateful that Mikey was able to say Kel Malay, not only on a personal level, but most importantly, for all those murdered by the Nazis. I believe it is imperative that we continue to say Kel Malay specifically for all those who died in the Shoah, for those who have no grave, for those families who have no one else to say it for them, for everyone murdered by the Nazis. And I believe that we as a community must continue to hear testimony from those who survived the Shoah. For the future of Am Yisrael, each life story we hear gives us another insight, not only into the horrific atrocities committed against us, but also into the great Gvura, the strength, and the resilience of Am Yisrael. Tonight, we are so privileged tonight to have Dr. Benjamin Garber join us and share his life story with us. Truly a story of courage, resilience, and belief in the future. Dr. Garber was born in 1936 in Vilna, Poland, a great center of Jewish life. His early years were spent in Vilna, in the ghetto, and in hiding. When he and his mother were liberated miraculously, by the Russian army. He was just 8 years old. He arrived in the States in 1949, went to high school, college, and medical school here. Dr. Garber is a well-known psychiatrist, has published many articles and books, including a book on his life story. He and his wife, who is here with him, live in Deerfield. Their family is evidence of Netzach Yisrael, the continuity and the future of the Jewish people, as they are blessed with 3 daughters, and in Dr. Garber's words, when I first spoke to him, they all married Jewish, and 8 grandchildren. Dr. Garber will speak, and then we will have time for questions. Also, if you are on Zoom and you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and type in a question. Dr. Garber, my deepest gratitude and admiration for agreeing to share your experiences and your life journey.
Thank you, Lynn. Vilna, Poland, where I was born in 1936, was considered the premier seat of Jewish culture, Jewish literature, religious fervor, and creativity in all of Eastern Europe. Vilna was referred to as Yerushalayim Delita, which means Jerusalem of Lithuania. My mother took pride in this, as she was born, raised, and educated in Vilna. Her parents and my father's parents were wealthy Jewish merchants, my mother's in meats and sausage, while my father's parents in lumber. My mother had an older brother and a younger brother, while my father had 2 brothers and a sister. My mother's older brother was the family golden boy, as he was a brilliant law student and my grandmother's favorite. He and my mother were very competitive, and she was my grandfather's favorite. I've seen pictures of my grandfather in which he comes across as a hard and stern patriarch. My connection with him became a family myth related to his heavy smoking. When I was born, he swore at my birth that he was never smoke again. However, it was too late, as he died just before the German occupation. The key person in the family constellation was my grandmother. She was my mother's mother, and I loved her and I adored her. In the early years of my life, my grandmother raised me. My mother was never around, while my grandmother was always there. When we lived in the Vilna ghetto, my mother was gone most of the time, as she was part of a work party that left the ghetto in the morning and came home in the evening. They were making heavy boots for the German soldiers that were freezing in the Russian steppes. When my mother was around, she was never around, as she was always up to something. What that mysterious something was didn't emerge until much later. Although I was able to construct a schematic picture of my mother's history and background, I didn't experience such luxury when it dealt with my father. When the subject was my father, there emerged a shadow, or perhaps a hole, which I spent most of my life trying to fill, but never quite succeeded. I learned about my father in later years, but even that was vague and sketchy. Now, the reason for so little knowledge about him was that when I was 2.5 years old, he disappeared from my life permanently. And all I have left is a grainy photo in which let me recognize the image of having had a father at one time. To compound the loss, my mother wrapped him in a shroud of silence, so at times I doubted that such a person ever existed. I heard how smart my father was. He was a highly successful attorney, which in Poland was a significant accomplishment for a Jew. He was an excellent student and very ambitious, and that's the extent of my knowledge of his character and his talents. My father's name was Jonah, as he was the oldest of 4 siblings with a sister and 2 brothers. All 3 of his siblings survived the Holocaust, and eventually they all wound up in Israel. I'm assuming that survival instincts of my father's family are quite strong. As a result, I have a large number of cousins in Israel with whom I have maintained sporadic contact. Perhaps my ability to have survived the Holocaust has had some genetic components. The issue of my father's death has remained an open question. One source attributed his death to the German troops that swept through Poland 2 weeks in September in 1939. Another one of my uncles felt that he was killed at the Katyn Forest massacre in Belarus by the Russians in 1941. So the time and the place of his death will never be known. From my training in psychiatry and psychoanalysis, I learned that a person's earliest memories may be significant indicators of one's earliest conflicts and anxieties. The accuracy of the material is not that important, but the internal consistency of how these memories fit with one another and with the narrative ultimately determines its usefulness. The response and attitudes of early caretakers may be equally revealing in understanding a person's character. They may be significant markers that set the tone for future developmental issues. And so it may be significant that my parents were never part of my earliest remembrances. Since my father was gone from the earliest years, and since my mother was never around, it is not surprising that my earliest memories focused on substitute caretakers. I must have been 3 or 4 years old as we were leaving a doctor's office when suddenly German airplanes appeared and it started to rain bombs. All that I remember is running down the street with my mother and nanny and being surrounded by the sounds of explosions. It was a beautiful summer day that suddenly turned dark and foreboding. If one has been exposed to the unsettling whistle of falling bombs, it is a sound that one never forgets. My next memory is from age 4. This memory is extremely detailed and vivid. It has also been recurrent, so I attribute importance to it as it has special meaning in the narrative of my life. We were staying at my grandmother's house. We were up on a balcony overlooking the courtyard. It was my mother, my grandmother, and my mother's older brother. Suddenly, there was a commotion in the courtyard as a number of people were milling about. A Lithuanian red-haired policeman in a blue suit motioned for my uncle to come down. Very innocently, he descended the stairs, never to be seen again. As the Germans set up the ghetto, they tried to squeeze all of the Jews in Vilna into one small part of the city with narrow cobblestone streets. My grandparents' house and their business were just inside the border of the ghetto, close to the main gate. This location was a positive in the history of our survival. While I was not totally aware of what was happening, I did realize that people were disappearing. The Germans would suddenly swoop down at night or day and remove people from their homes and from streets. These raids were called akties, or actions. Once the people were removed, they were loaded in waiting trucks and were told that they were being taken to labor camps. That implied that they were coming back. However, it was soon realized that they were being taken to destinations unknown and that they were never, ever coming back. As a result, hiding became a common activity when it was obvious that the Germans were coming. We became preoccupied with finding new, obscure, and more creative hiding places. Once we hid in the attic, my grandmother's house, there were many people and it was crowded and hot and uncomfortable. At first, there was a sense that we were all in this together, but after a while, tempers were frayed and there were arguments. So the stress of having to hide and the fear of being caught and removed was an ever-present danger. Another time we were hiding in a cellar. Once again, there were many people and there was a couple with a baby. The baby started to cry and we could hear the Germans outside. If the baby didn't stop crying, we would be caught. Finally, someone suggested stuffing a rag in the baby's mouth to keep it quiet. Fortunately, it never came to that as the Germans left and we survived this time. These incidents were some of my earliest memories from the occupation. I attribute meaning and significance to these events in determining who I was and who I became. I'm also aware that the knowledge as to why people are the way they are is limited. There are just too many variables that shape our character. So I feel somewhat entitled to attribute meaning to these events and their impact on my psyche. However, before I become too glib in attributing causality to random events, let's not lose sight of the fact that these incidents occurred within a matrix of constant fear and constant terror. Now, the Vilna Ghetto was created in 1941 and liquidated in September of 1943. I know this because my mother and I escaped from the ghetto the night before it was liquidated. It was one of the numerous coincidences that contributed to our survival. Before the war, Wilno had a Jewish population of 60,000. The ghetto had a population of 40,000, of which only 1,300 survived. The ghetto became a self-contained entity, closed by brick walls, barbed wire, and guards. That didn't mean that individuals or even small groups could not get out of the ghetto if they resorted to bribes or other creative means. And then there were always the sewers. The Judenrat, or Jewish Council, were responsible for the administration of the ghetto. There was also a ghetto police whose job it was to maintain order and to help the Germans round up people for deportations. I guess the police assumed that they would be scared. The leader of the ghetto was a man named Jacob Gans. He must have been guided by some kind of magical vision that if he acceded to the German demands for more bodies, he would save people. When he realized that he couldn't make a difference, as the Germans were never satisfied, he committed suicide. The Germans were smart enough to realize that if they could normalize life in the ghetto, they would be less resistant to the approaching liquidation. There were numerous cultural events and activities in the ghetto, original plays, lectures, and concerts. I remember attending plays with my mother and grandmother. I'm sure that seeing plays made me feel good. However, such moments were few and far between. I remember certain original songs that we would hum and sing. Never say that this is your final path. My name is Frolik and I'm a lad from the ghetto. And even though things are bad, I still manage to jump, dance, and sing. I suppose that anything that made one feel good, even for a few moments, was important. I think that people in the ghetto made a concentrated effort to maintain a sense of normality under very abnormal circumstances. Just how effective this was is impossible to determine. Perhaps the effort itself is somewhat meaningful, and yet it was deceptive because after all, we were all waiting to die. The main reason that I survived the ghetto experience, relatively unscathed emotionally, was the love and the protection of my grandmother. I missed her more than anyone I was ever close with. She shielded me and protected me from all the terrible things around us. She enveloped me with her love so that nothing could harm me. She was always present, no matter what the conditions or the circumstances. I could always recall her sad face as I never saw her smile. But then how could she? Because by then she already experienced multiple losses. I was not privy to the conversations of adults and the ongoing whisperings, as I had the sense that something was being planned. However, I learned not to ask any questions. I detected rumblings about escaping the ghetto. There were rumors of concentration camps where people were being gassed. There was black bunting on the trees when the Russians defeated the Germans at the Battle of Stalingrad. There were recurrent rumors that the Germans were losing the war. However, we also knew that we would be killed or sent to concentration camps before the Russians could liberate us. There were rumors from work parties that people escaped into the forest to join the partisans. The forest of Poland and Belarus, where people went to when they escaped the ghetto. While the surrounding forests were relative safe havens, we also heard that the Polish and Lithuanian populations were of no help to the escapees. I finally understood my mother's frantic activity and occasional disappearances had something to do with escaping the ghetto. My mother, in conjunction with other people, was setting up a hiding place outside of the city. While I have been critical of my mother for her mothering abilities and her relationship with my grandmother, I was equally cognizant of her many strengths and the resilience of her character. Now, how all this planning came about and how it was organized and how these various strangers came together was never explained. All that I knew was that there was a place somewhere out there waiting for us, and at the appointed time, we will walk through the front gate and leave. On a couple of occasions, the plans were changed because the guards changed or it wasn't dark enough. The prearranged day to escape finally arrived. It was cold and dark, and I was dressed in a couple layers of clothing as there was a limit to how much we could carry. My grandmother and I stood in the courtyard, which was next to the gate. My mother was negotiating with the guards about money. As my mother was walking back, I realized that my grandmother was not coming with us and that we were leaving her behind. As I was saying goodbye to her, I asked if I would ever see her again, and she said that she didn't know. All that I remembered was that my mother grabbed me by the arm and we hurriedly walked out the front gate of the ghetto. Now, the question of why we left my grandmother behind has stayed with me and haunted me most of my life. The simplistic way of looking at it is that for everyone that survives, someone has to pay a price. And so I lived and my grandmother died. That, however, doesn't answer the question about the choices that people make. The choices are an integral part of the Holocaust equation. Maybe it was a practical decision, as she felt that my grandmother would be too much of a burden because of her age. It is possible that the guards would allow only 2 people to leave at a time, so my mother had to make a painful choice. It is also possible that my grandmother refused to leave and chose to stay where things were familiar rather than take a chance on the unknown. And so when I was little, I felt that it was my fault that she died and that my mother chose to save me. My mother was excellent at reinforcing that belief. Whenever she was unhappy with me, she would let me know that she regretted leaving my grandmother behind and saving me. She would let me know that she regretted leaving my grandmother behind and she had misgivings about having saved me. It was her guilt that was displaced onto me. Nevertheless, as much as I would want to rationalize her decision, the guilt was never distant. I asked my mother about it because I missed my grandmother. I didn't get much of a response except a dismissive comment that I would not understand. And so as we exited the ghetto, I couldn't see much as the experience was one big blur. My mother was clutching my hand as I was stumbling next to her. I felt that I was being dragged. I asked her where we were going, but I got no response. As it turned out, we were to spend the night at the home of this Polish couple who used to work for my parents. We experienced a sense of freedom and relief in leaving the ghetto. Little did we know that our prison-like experience was just beginning. We woke up the next morning on a gloomy, rainy day. The sky was overcast, dark, gloomy clouds rolled over the city. This was good as my mother and I were less visible. The gentleman told us that the ghetto was surrounded by German troops, which meant that it was being liquidated. I didn't fully comprehend that all the residents of the ghetto are being sent to concentration camps. I still nurtured the hope that my grandmother would survive and that I would see her. I entertained this fantasy for a long time until it finally dawned on me how she must have felt all alone in the knowledge that soon she was going to die. We then began our long trek across the city to our prepared hiding place. My mother had dark complexion and dark curly hair. She wrapped her face in a dark, thick shawl to cover most of her features. I, however, being fair-skinned and blonde, was left uncovered. There was at least one other time when my being fair-skinned and blonde may have contributed to our survival. My mother hailed a horse-drawn carriage that took us across the city. I could tell that it was far because the house that we entered was close to the railroad yards. The house was situated on an empty field, which was by the railroad. It was well hidden from the prying eyes of neighbors. We entered a small, undistinguished-looking cottage, which was inhabited by an older woman with 2 daughters. The house had all sorts of icons and crosses on the walls. Being exposed to these non-Jewish religious items made me very uncomfortable. I felt that I was being disloyal to the one and only Jewish deity. My mother and the old woman engaged in a lengthy discussion, probably having to do with the money for hiding us. We then walked to a large tool shed a couple hundred yards away. The shed was on a small elevation. Inside of the shed, there were wooden counters along the walls, and beneath one of the counters, there was a trapdoor with an opening to a ladder down a cellar that was inhabited by 18 other people. This place was going to be our home for the next 11 months. Initially, people did not appear distinctive. That was probably because of the darkness and my anxiety. I immediately noticed a blonde-haired boy who was a couple years older, and his name was Lolek. There was an attractive young woman in her 20s. Her name was Rivka. In an ideal state, we should have become one big, cooperative, happy family. It never became a reality until the very end, when survival was at stake. Until that very moment, we existed in a constant state of tension, anxiety, and fear. There was fear about what was happening outside, especially trusting the 3 women. Would they betray us? We never knew. We also experienced fear in relation to one another, as tempers were short with frequent flare-ups over minor issues. How this place was set up and what was involved in building it was never talked about. How this Polish family was found was another mystery. They took a big risk making this commitment, and so we would be tempted to label them as righteous Gentiles. However, they received a lot of money for this, and at the end they tried to betray us, but it was too late. If they were discovered harboring Jews, they would have been shot. We were aware of this, and for that reason alone, we appreciated what they did for us. Seeing our hiding place for the first time made a profound impression. At various times, it was seen as a cellar, a basement, but to me, it seemed like one big cavern with 20 different people of various shapes and sizes. The most prominent characteristic that stayed with me all these years was the darkness of the place. There was no electricity. We had candles that we never used. And so the only continuous light was a brick removed from the eastern wall. However, on gloomy and rainy days, we were almost in total darkness. The beds were lined up along the walls, and our few belongings were stuffed under them. Still, it has always felt like we had limited space, and that may have contributed to the feeling of constant animosity and irritation. In the evening and at night, we were allowed to go up into the shed on a rotating basis to experience contact with the outside world. We had a strange, hostile, dependent relationship with our three caretakers. They brought us food twice a day in large pails or buckets and removed waste. This was done by the two daughters. We never saw the old lady until the very end. The food that they provided for us was adequate. It consisted of soups, bread, vegetables, and sometimes fruit. I do not remember most of the people in the cellar. However, there were two individuals that had an impact, Jablonski and Rivka. Mr. Jablonski was a man in his 50s. He was very learned and a great storyteller. We both experienced medical problems. I, with my delicate stomach, and he had arthritis. He regaled me with stories of the Arabian Nights, Sinbad the Sailor, and Princess Scheherazade. He was also the moral compass of the group and the final arbiter of all disputes, as there were too many. He and I were drawn to one another by our limitations. A person that stood out in my mind was Rivka, the young woman. She was personable, outgoing, most importantly, she spoke flawless German that she learned in school. She was a major player in the drama of our survival. Thinking back, I couldn't help but wonder what we did with all the free time and how we passed the days. We had minimal reading material, which was in Polish. We didn't have any games or other materials that could be used to pass the time. Perhaps that was a major reason why there were so many arguments. There were no outlets to discharge excess energy. Boredom and anxiety were a constant presence, and I know that we slept a lot. In the evenings and at night, we would open the trapdoor and climb up into the shed in small groups on a rotating basis. We looked forward to these upper-level excursions as it gave us a brief chance to experience the outside world. Even though time was dragging on, spring turned into summer. We had an inkling that there were changes in the air unrelated to the change in the seasons. The railroad yards were busier with more traffic. We could count the trains carrying supplies and troops from west to east. We could also see an increase in fortifications. There were anti-aircraft guns, camouflage, and lots of barbed wire. It was not long before we figured out the reason for all this activity. We heard numerous airplanes, air raid sirens, searchlights, and the explosions of bombs. We assumed that these were Russian airplanes, and we were joyful that the war was coming closer, and perhaps we were on the threshold of liberation. However, our initial excitement subsided when a bomb exploded within our line of sight. A large piece of the bomb's casing fell beneath the wall of the shed and lodged under one of the windows. That could have easily decimated a part of our hiding place. We didn't fully appreciate that railroad yards can become inviting targets for bombing raids. Initially, the air raids were only at night. After a while, they increased in frequency and intensity. Sleeping became more difficult as people would stay up at night to keep track of the activities. There was much anxiety about our hiding place being destroyed. There was commotion in our area with an increasing massing of troops and an increase in fortification. One day, all three of the Gentile women showed up to discuss future plans and changes. Not such a great idea. It was evident that the war zone was moving closer, and we had no idea how these changes would impact on us. They demanded from now on that we should stay below all the time, for there's a greater chance of being detected, that there are more eyes all around. No more visits to the shed at night. They also will remain in the house all the time with less visits. This implied less food. They demanded that we start rationing food, staying in the cellar all the time to communicate by whispering, since we tended to get loud at times. They were more cognizant of the possibility that we could be discovered. And so as the days increased confinement wore on, we became more anxious and spent every second peering out our little window. We created all sorts of fantasies and fanciful scenarios about the outside world. We were hoping for a quick surrender and the appearance of Russian troops. However, what occurred was just the opposite. After the bombings diminished, we became aware of artillery fire, which meant that the war zone was drawing closer and we would be right in the midst of it. We kept track of the explosions and their intensity, but our conclusions were pure guesswork. We lost complete contact with the three women. As a result, we became totally isolated from the outside world, without food and without water. We became aware of the frantic activity above us in the shed. There was loud talking and there was the barking of orders in German. So instead of our wishes for the Germans to surrender meekly, it became evident that our shed became the focus of another Stalingrad-like battle. I had no inkling at the time this was going to become the most horrendous week of my life. After being cooped up for long stretches of time, with limited access to the outside world, we became attuned to what was happening outside. So this is how we assessed the military situations. The Russians were in a village a couple hundred yards away. We knew this because we could see the red flag. The Russians were very fond of their artillery, so they used that instead of using infantry to dislodge the Germans. The Germans were in a great position defensively, as our cellar and shed were on an elevation with excellent visual command of the area. They had either one or two machine guns, which kept the Russians at bay, spraying the area intermittently. The staccato machine gun noise became a familiar sound. So there emerged a military stalemate between the Russian artillery and the German machine guns. The Russians were hoping that their superior artillery would knock out the Germans. The prize would be the wide open railroads. The problem with that plan was that we were caught right in the middle. This standoff lasted 4 days and 3 nights. Our impressions of what was transpiring militarily were accurate, as we were later informed by our liberators. Since it was the middle of summer, it was very hot, and we became desperate. 2 people were so thirsty that they drank their own urine. I licked the dew from the bricks in the morning. The tension, the thirst, and the hunger were just too much. We could tolerate the hunger, but the thirst was awful. The Germans above us in the shed, the uncertainty of our fate, the liberation so close yet so far, for all these reasons, things were just too much. As a result, 3 of the men lifted the trapdoor and they ran out of the cellar. Just where they would go and what they were planning was not clear, as this was a desperate, suicidal act. On the 4th day, the inevitable happened. The trapdoor opened very slowly, and the helmeted head of a German soldier peered into our hiding place. He came down the ladder, and then a second one, and a third one. They looked around with a certain amusement. What they saw was a number of women and 2 blonde-haired boys. The men were hidden out of sight behind clothing and blankets under the beds. And then Rivka, our German-speaking savior, sprang into action. She told them that we were Polish, that we were hiding from the Russians. We heard that the Russian soldiers were savages and they rape women and they kill innocent women and children. We also told them that we were hungry and thirsty. All this was not pre-planned. It was a spontaneous story that the Germans believed. To this day, I will never understand why they believed us. They made no connection with the 3 men that ran out the day before. These were frontline troops, too preoccupied with their own survival in the midst of fighting a war. And so for the next 4 days, we coexisted with the Wehrmacht. They treated us well. They gave us water and some food, and one of the German soldiers gave me a piece of chocolate. And so we shared our space with the enemy who could turn on us any minute and kill us. The fear and the terror that consumed us during those 4 days was beyond comprehension. It became obvious that our hiding place had become a primary fortification against the onrushing Red Army. By the second day, the Germans built a trench through the cellar to the back of the shed where they set up a command post. There was a table with maps and telephone wires with constant orders going back and forth. There was an invisible wall between them and us. They wanted about the business of war, or all we cared about was survival. It was essential for us to talk Polish among ourselves, which was sometimes forgotten. Rivka became our policewoman and our conscience to make sure that we were quiet, whispered only in Polish among ourselves, and Lolek and I, the other boy and I, were prominently displayed. There was a major incident during the second day of our coexistence. The Germans were dug in solidly, and they were not dislodged, while the Russian artillery shelling intensified. Suddenly, a Russian artillery shell made a direct hit on the eastern wall of our hiding place, and it seemed like everything exploded. The wall started to crumble, bricks were flying all over, and there was dust and chaos. People were screaming, and the woman was sobbing in Yiddish that she was being buried alive. People pulled her out. She was fine. Someone put their hand over her mouth to keep her quiet. In my panic, I ran into the German command post, and it seemed the only safe place. The German soldiers shooed me back into the cellar as they were yelling, "Raus, raus," which of course means get out. In some miraculous way, the explosion hurt no one except for a few scratches. The older woman continued to cry and scream in Yiddish, and once again, someone forcibly closed her mouth. After the explosion, one half of our hiding place was in rubble. Some of the men were terrified of being buried alive. We repositioned them while the soldiers were too busy to notice. The soldiers congregated in the command post, poring over their maps, while we were hoping that they were planning to withdraw. While this was going on, they gave us some crackers and water. There was a constant state of dread as we had no idea what was coming next. We sat and we lay on the floor attached to our spots, fixed in our positions like statues. Now we were afraid of the Russian artillery as we were wide open targets. The third night, it became evident that the Germans were finally planning to retreat. Things were getting quieter, and it looked like they were collecting their equipment. We heard snatches of conversation, but there were fewer voices and some strange sounds. A German officer came to talk to Rivka, and he told her that they were leaving. However, they were going into the city to continue the battle. He suggested that we come along because the Russians are wild animals, that they rape women, and they kill children. So for our safety, we should retreat with them. Otherwise, he couldn't guarantee our fate. She thanked him for his concern and told him that she had to consult with the rest of the group, just to make it look like we were debating what to do. We had no intention of going back with them. She went back and told him that the children are sick from the lack of food and water, and that they are not strong enough to go anywhere. The hidden issue, of course, was the men under the beds. What would happen to them if we left? Rivka told him that we would take our chances and stay where we were. He said that he couldn't do for us anymore. He said goodbye, and then he left. And so the rest of the night was probably one of the longest nights of our lives. We sat and we waited because we had no idea as to what was happening around us. We heard women's voices, and we thought that perhaps the Polish women were betraying us. There was an issue of the three men that ran out, what happened to them? Were they telling the Germans about the rest of us? So we sat the whole night in silence and in terror. It seemed like any minute something bad could happen. In the morning, it started to rain, first heavy, and then it was a drizzle. We still refused to move as everything around us was quiet, while the explosions seemed further and further away. And so we sat in the midst of our minimal shelter, as our hiding place was a pile of rubble. From the silence, we heard the first Russian words, which I will never forget for the rest of my life. Где командир нашей роты, which means, where is the commander of our squad? We looked at one another and we didn't know what to do. We were about to respond when one of the men said, "It's a German trick. And if they see us welcoming the Russians, they will shoot us. So don't move." And so we sat there longer. Was it minutes? Was it hours? We looked up, and all of a sudden we looked up, and there was a Russian soldier. And there was another one, and another one. And then we realized that we were free, and that no one was going to threaten us or shoot us ever again. So we ran up to them, and we kept saying spasibo, which means thank you, and we hugged them, and we cried from happiness. Now, there was a certain beauty and irony in our liberation. The commanding officer of the Russian troops that liberated us was a major, and he was Jewish. He said that we were the first Jews that he had come across since the city of Minsk in Belarus. So the beauty of this is that we were liberated from the Nazis by a Jew. And so it was the summer of 1944. And even though I was 8 years old, I started to feel the beginning of certain changes inside of me. We survived some bad things, but my mother and I came out of it in pretty good shape. I started to think about the future, about going to school, about playing with other kids, and about reading books, which is something I had never done before. These thoughts kept coming back over and over because it was a harbinger of things to come. And it occurred to me to remember and to record just what we had been through, the good and the bad, and that's just what I did. And so it seemed that all of these thoughts were swirling around in my head. And so I finally realized that all the things that happened to us were not the end of anything at all, but they were only the beginning. Thank you.
More than 60 people on.
I don't. There's like 60.
Yeah, good.
Okay. So anyone who's on the Zoom, if you have any questions, please feel free to just write them in, and then we'll write them into the chat and we'll take them as they come. Anyone in person here have any questions that you wanted to ask? You can raise your hand in person here, or just say. What? Do you have a question?
It only takes the first person, you know.
Go ahead. It'll help others.
When did I do it?
Yeah, how old were you at the time?
Oh, this? Oh,
Wrote down some notes?
no. No, I remembered most of the stuff. And the writing of it was recent. And this book, which you may have seen, Child of the Ghetto, was came out in March. And it's available through Amazon.
There's a question. I may have missed this in the beginning, but did you have siblings?
No, I'm an only child.
I think that they're referring to the
Oh,
So.
well, my real fathers, because my mother remarried after the war, but my real father's siblings, he had two brothers and a sister, and they all survived the Holocaust and they all wound up in Israel. And I have many cousins in Israel with whom I maintain sporadic contact. In Israel, oh yeah, sure. How could I not?
Where we, another question from that Greenberg, where were you taken once you were liberated, and how did you come to the States?
Oh, well, that's a long involved story. Well, we were liberated, and as I mentioned already, my mother remarried, and um, what happened was how things were in Poland after the liberation was pretty bad, and there were pogroms in Poland, and a lot of Jews were killed, especially in the city of Kelsey. If you heard about it, there were I think 47 people killed there at one time, and so we decided, my mother and I and my stepfather, we decided to leave Vilna, and we went through Czechoslovakia, Austria, to the American zone in Germany, and that's where we were for 2 years. And then I came to the States in 1949. I was 13 years old at the time.
There's two questions. One is from Steve. Did you maintain contact with the people
That
you
we
were with
survived with.
Oh, no, two questions. Yeah, that you survived.
Yeah, to some extent. My mother became very good friends with Rivka, the woman that spoke the German that helped to survive. And she wound up in London, and my mother visited her on a couple of occasions. Mr. Yablonsky survived. He was in Israel, and my mother visited him also. These were the only two people that we had contact with after the war.
Agent Angela has a question. Have you been back to Vilna since the war?
I have not. I had no desire to go back.
Also, what are your thoughts on Lithuania's distortion of their role?
Yeah, well, that's a long, involved story. As I'm sure is known, or should be known, Lithuanians were very cooperative with the Germans in helping to get rid of us. I mean, that's basically what they did. And I think that's one of the reasons why I have not gone back. The Lithuanians were very anti-Semitic, and I'm assuming that they still are. I don't know, haven't been there, but I'm assuming these things never change. This kind of stuff goes on from generation to generation.
Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. And I'm curious, pursued a career in medicine, and particularly psychiatry.
Mhm.
Is that informed by your experience? as a
Of course,
child?
of course. My subspecialty is parent loss.
Oh.
So that speaks for itself.
Were you ever able to track down what happened to your grandmother? I mean, there are records, let's say, Yad Vashem, there are records.
No, my mother tried to track it down. It wasn't very successful. We finally gave up after a while and felt that everybody was killed. So, yeah, some efforts were made, but the general feeling was that it was kind of hopeless.
When I hear your story, and takes a lot of, I think, motivation and work, inner strength, and my success for life to pursue, to move to the States, pursue, pursue medicine, go ahead, build. Where do you think, what do you attribute this success for life and this desire
To keep going?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I don't know. I wish I could give you a succinct answer in a paragraph that would explain it. But I've always been very intense, as you can tell. I've been driven to do things, and I've always enjoyed writing. I've written a couple other books having to do with psychiatry, not with the survival. And so, but I think that the wish to tell my story and go into so much detail and spend so much time elaborating on it, I think was stimulated by my children. Well, one of them is here. My oldest daughter, Rebecca, is here. I have two other daughters, Louise and Deborah. And the incident that sort of turned things in that direction was one time during Passover. Actually, it was Passover, and everybody was out of town. So we finally decided just to have a family Seder, my wife and I and our three kids. And my kids then asked me, what happened to me? So that's when I told them. That was the first time that I was able to tell them in detail what I've been through. And I think that they've been involved in this process ever since. Yeah, my mother was alive. I think all three of my grandchildren were alive when my mother was alive. Right? No, she didn't. She just knew you and Louise and didn't know Deborah.
Oh, your children,
Yeah.
yes.
The children. She met, that's right. My parents met Michael. That's right. Son-in-law. No. Yes, Reverend.
I'm curious, you had obviously a journey after a period of silence to be able to speak about your experience, and your children were a catalyst for that.
Right.
You mentioned in passing, maybe more than passing, that oftentimes questions that you asked of your own mother met with silence with the Smith. And I'm wondering, in the intervening years, knowing that she don't,
Did that change?
she still just have a wall she would
Yeah,
talk about?
she had a wall. And it's a shame because as I hinted here, my mother was a very strong woman. But the last number of years of her life, she sort of lost it. And she was afraid of the Germans, and she would lock the doors and the windows, and she worried about Germans, coming after us. So I think whatever zest and drive that she had, I think was gone. And but she was there when she had to be.
AJ, have one more. Are you a fan, I guess that's the way he said it, of Viktor Frankl?
I'm familiar with his stuff, but I don't know that much about him.
I have one more question. Because talk about the Seder and, I said,
Right.
And you were very young. My parents survived. So I the fact that they were strong about the Jewish future.
Mhm.
People continuity to the foundation. But your formative like really young years. So where do you think what really spread
I just grew up with that. That's what I grew up with. I mean, that's how I was raised. And I never doubted anything else. I mean, this was it for me, and always been a strong supporter of Israel. I just didn't know anything else.
Any other questions on this end?
So before we conclude tonight, a word of a Karat HaTov, and also making a connection over Zoom. There are more than 60 people on Zoom. And among them, we welcome Dr. Leo Schachter, who was our speaker for Kristallnacht in 2020. First time we had to be on Zoom, I think, or the second time. And Dr. Schachter lives in West Hempstead, New York, and survived Kristallnacht, was with his family in Berlin, and he was our guest. And now is on Zoom from West Hempstead, Dr. Garber, to join you. Maybe we'll have occasion one day to meet in person. And we thank you so much for bearing witness. for telling us your story, and for reminding us that, as Professor Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi writes in his book, Zachor, is professor of history at Columbia University, there's a difference between history and memory. History is what we read in books. It's what historians can teach us. It's lessons learned in a classroom. Memory is something that is lived and experienced. And Jewish people, until the advent of the modern era, knew nothing about history and knew everything about memory, about being at a Pesach Seder and telling a story, about being together with family, about being in a shul and knowing the older people and the younger people and the connections. And what you've done for us tonight is really an act of great memory in communicating with us, those of us who are here in person, those of us who are in Texas, in New York, in Chicago, in Florida, in different states. I was going through the roster, different people, members of our shul and other shuls who are joining us. We thank you so much for that. We'll conclude the evening now with the recitation of the memorial prayer that our congregation has always said on Yom Hashoa. We have it in our Minhag book, which is itself a book not of history, but of memory, since it goes on the cycle annually. And this is what our forebears set up for us. It's a special prayer, memorial prayer for the martyrs of the Holocaust. I'll recite it now to conclude the evening. Hopefully everyone will take stock over the period of the next, at least over the period of the next 24 hours, if not longer, to read, to learn, and especially to connect with survivors of the Shoah, not only in terms of their harrowing story, but of the reality that they live on, survived, built families in so many instances, and follow the dictum that an Aaron Cohen was told so many years ago of Lo Yamut, not to die, but to keep living. Please rise. We'll recite now the memorial prayer. Avinu Malkeinu, El Elohei HaRuchot V'Chol Basar, Amtzenu Chanechona Tachat Kanfei HaShechina, V'Ma'alot Kedoshim U'Tehorim Kizora Ki HaMazirim, Et Nishmotehem Shel 600 Revavot Alfei Yisrael, Anashim V'Nashim Yiladim V'Yiladot, Shenehergu V'Shenisrafu V'Shenitbechu, V'Shenechneku V'Shenichberu Chayim, V'Yidei Tzorei Ameinu B'Galut Europa, Kulam Kedoshim Tehorim, Geonim V'Tzadikim, Azel Chanon V'Direi HaTorah, V'Gan Eden Tehemenu Chatam, Lachein Bal Harachamim Yitzor V'Tzorchem Et Nishmatam, Adonai Hu Nachalatam, V'Yizkor Lanu Akedatam, V'Ta'amod Lanu L'Chol Yisrael Zechutam, Eretz Al Techasi Damam, V'Al Yehi Makom L'Zakatam, Yizchutam Nidchei Yisrael Yeshuv L'Achuzatam, Zecher Tzidkatam, Ya'aleh Tamid L'Fanecha, Yavo Shalom Yanuch Al Mishkavotam, V'Nomar Amen. Hope to gather together soon for happier occasions for Simchas. Thank you again, Dr. Garber. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Herb. Thank you, Phil. And thank you.